Good afternoon, and welcome to a regular workshop meeting of the Oak Harbor City Council. Today is March 28th, and it is 2 p.m. in the afternoon, and we have some people with us here at the table. We'll go around the table and introduce ourselves. I'm Bob Severance, Mayor.
Rick Almerick, City Council.
Beth Munns, Mayor Pro Tem.
Bill Larson, City Council.
Patricia Soul, Finance Director.
Kevin Dresker, Chief of Police.
Emma House, Human Resources Director.
Joel Servadius, City Council.
Erica Wassinger, City Council.
Thank you. I'd like to point out that Patricia Soul is also serving as our interim city administrator. So with that said, I'd like to start the agenda with human resources, and I think I'll turn it back over to Emma.
Thank you, Mayor. Good afternoon, Council. I have one new employee to introduce to you today, and I'm very excited to introduce Becky Boone. Becky came and started her full-time employment as a water specialist on February 12th, and I have to say the entire Public Works Department was very excited for Becky because she actually worked for us as a seasonal back in 2016. So we're excited to have her. She most recently worked at the United States Postal Service, and she has past experiences in emergency services and early childhood education. Becky also has her associate's degree in geology, and she most recently obtained her wastewater technician certification from Skagit Valley College. Well, I was going. You're going for it.
Yes.
So you're
I
close.
haven't completed it, but
You're
yes,
close.
I started the course.
Yay. So we're excited to have you in our water division. Thank you so much for joining us, and please welcome Becky to our team. Okay. So I also have the next agenda item. And the next agenda item is the labor agreement for the Oak Harbor Police Association commissioned unit. But I thought it would be a great opportunity to take a couple minutes and give you an update overall on workforce management from Human Resources. I know I shared this presentation with you by email a few weeks ago. We were hoping to get to council a little bit sooner for this presentation. But since it's been a few weeks, I thought I'd go ahead and go through the presentation, and then at the end, I'm sure you're going to have questions for myself, Chief Dresker, and possibly Patricia as well. So to kind of give you some information on the background, some common terms, who are our bargaining units and our non-bargaining units. The bargaining process that we go through will go over the commissioned unit labor agreement and then a brief summary. So to give you a quick background, in the past we have used outside professional services for negotiations. That has been a costly process, and it also has been a lengthy process. In the past, we haven't had a very consistent analysis of the impact of our negotiations from specific work groups to our entire workforce, which is something that we really want to try to do more often. And I've noticed that we really want to make sure we develop a negotiation strategy moving forward, short-term and long-term, because we do have multiple contracts. We've noticed in the past year or so that recruitment and relocation has gotten very competitive. There's a lot of cities that are now offering recruitment and relocation bonuses ranging from $2,500 to $15,000. We're not really able to go there, and we're not wanting to be in that area of competition. We'd rather focus on retaining our employees that we get here and modernizing our workforce and our facility, which Chief Dresker has really done an amazing job in the short time that he's been here. So to give you a couple of common terms, labor union, I also refer to our labor union very often as our bargaining unit employees who belong to that union. Collective bargaining agreement is our union contract that sets out their wages and terms and conditions of employment. Grievance is the process or the procedure that we would go through if there was a dispute that we cannot resolve easily. And if for some reason we're unable to resolve that grievance, or if we're unable to go through a successful bargaining process, then we may go to arbitration. From Human Resources, I highly encourage a good working relationship with our union stewards, who are our employee reps, but also the union representatives. I think it's super important to communicate with them regularly. It helps to resolve issues easily, and hopefully avoids going through a grievance process or ending up in arbitration. I also added that it's also super important for us because it makes it so that negotiations are productive and that they get through a quicker process and they don't go too lengthy, getting delayed, because you have a better relationship internally. When you have outside services during your negotiations, it kind of leaves a little bit of a gap for that knowledge and that relationship. If you can do it internally, it's a lot more successful. So I really highly encourage communicating with the unions regularly. So now let's talk about who are your bargaining and non-bargaining units, so your union or non-union areas. So you have a total of 3 unions, and there is 5 different collective bargaining agreements. So the International Association of Firefighters, the Police Association Commission Unit and Non-Commission Unit, and then our Teamsters who represent the Marina employees and also the Teamsters that represent the Public Works employees. And then all of these contracts are located on our website and through the employee drive because they are references for our employees and management. And to give you an idea, at the time of when I did this, and as I mentioned, numbers do fluctuate a little bit here and there based on our recruitment and turnover, but there were 9 members in the Firefighters Association, 22 at the time in the commissioned, 12 in the non-commissioned, 3 for the Teamsters Marina, and 32 for our Public Works area. So a total of 78 employees are currently covered by union labor contracts. And then to give you an idea of the timeline of our negotiations with these 3 different unions and their 5 different contracts. Coming up this fall, we'll be negotiating with our firefighters. And recently, back in December, we brought forward to you the Police Association's non-commissioned agreement that we were able to settle before their last contract expired, which was really nice, and we were able to get it approved before the new year started, which made it so that we didn't have to calculate any type of retro compensation, which can get very difficult and time-consuming if we end up having negotiations go into a new year where a contract should have been ratified and approved. So we're hoping that we can bring the commission contract to you for council approval very soon. It has recently gone through the association vote. So the Police Association membership comes together and they vote on all of our tentative agreement terms, and then we bring it to council for approval. Coming up also this fall and winter, we have the Teamsters contracts that we'll be negotiating. So Marina and also the Public Works. So 3 different contracts that are going to be coming up very soon. So who are your non-bargaining units? There's 3 major non-bargaining units. They are your non-represented employees, your paid-on-call firefighters, and then those who are covered by employee contract agreements. In 2017, we did do a classification and compensation study that basically addresses the wages and terms and conditions of employment for this group. To give you an idea of how many people were involved, there was 54 non-represented employees, 29 paid-on-call firefighters, and 7 contracted employee agreements, so a total of 90 employees that are not covered by unions. And to kind of sum it up for you, 78 employees under union contracts, 90 not under union contracts. Give and take a couple here and there whenever we're doing recruitment and turnover. So then to briefly go over what is our collective bargaining process, you'll hear me refer to it as collective bargaining and also as interest-based bargaining. It's basically us coming together with the union. One of us gives a notice to bargain saying that we're ready, and then each of our sides kind of builds their team. Our team comes together, we have meetings, we establish what our proposal should be, and then eventually both sides come together and start that bargaining session process. I would really like to give major credit to our internal labor relations team, myself, Chief Dresker, Patricia, Steve Powers, and our former city administrator. We met regularly as a labor management team and then came to the table with our proposals during bargaining. Each side presents proposals, but then there's also counter proposals and modified proposals, and it goes back and forth quite a few times. I often say it's similar to a dance because you're just like back and forth until you can find that even medium ground that's going to make both sides hopefully okay. If bargaining goes successfully, then obviously it would go to the ratification vote, council approval for us to get a new contract to follow for a period of time. If for some reason bargaining is unsuccessful, then it may lead us into mediation or arbitration. Usually I like to think that we're going to be successful because we're negotiating with the union and the respective management team for that bargaining group. The CBAs are going to help us for a period of time, usually between 2 to 5 years, on how to manage that work group. As I said before, it does address wages and benefits, and I often refer to it as a very essential tool for workforce management for both the employee and their manager or director. It's a good resource. So if for some reason we don't get a successful contract, and if we're not able to go back to the table and reach agreement, we may go to mediation for a facilitator, or we may go to arbitration. And it's important to know your groups that have that ability. So your essential employees do have the ability to proceed to mediation and arbitration. Your essential employees include your firefighters, police officers, and those other ones listed there that we currently do not have. But specifically, this is referring to your government employees who we cannot afford to not be performing. They need to continue to provide those vital services to the community, and in doing so, they need to have a contract agreement that they follow those terms and conditions of employment. So that's why it's important for them to have a timely response in this process. And if we were to go to arbitration, it's a very costly process. Both sides do determine an arbitrator. Most arbitrators agree that when you go to arbitration, they're going to look at whatever would have been the reachable agreement between both parties. A lot of times they look at whatever the issue is and they try to split it down the middle to make it as even as possible. One of the things that I often tell the labor relations team internally is that we want to keep in mind all of those factors that an arbitrator would be looking at in case we get to that point of going to arbitration. So we want to make sure that we're mindful in how an arbitrator might be thinking in the proposals that we're drafting, and also in how we're responding to the proposals that we're being given. So what would be those factors that I'm always thinking about? What is the internal pattern of other employees in the workplace? Are other employee groups that are in unions or that are not in unions? What do our external comparisons show? So of course that's our comps. What is our ability to pay? What is our budget? What is our projected financials? Is there a compelling need for change? So is it something that we need to change operationally? Is it something that we need to change because we know there's a law coming up or a training requirement coming up? Or is it something that just might be nice to have? And then we always want to know, what is the arbitration case history, or are there any current arbitration cases, which is obviously where we go to legal for their expertise, and they're very helpful in keeping us up to date. So now let's get into the Oak Harbor Police Association commissioned unit. This is your second largest bargaining unit with 22 members, give or take a couple. And we began negotiations back in August 2017, and we were able to conclude negotiations by January of 2018. So it was about a 6-month process of having regular meetings. The association did vote to accept this tentative agreement on February 26th. The tentative agreement does cover a 3-year term, 2018, 2019, and 2020. For 2018, we looked at our wages and the ranges of our wages, and we determined that we needed to do some market adjustments to get into the comparable range for the current year. And then we tentatively agreed to a 2.25 COLA for 2019 and also for 2020. The next things we negotiated were we agreed to add 1 additional floating holiday for a total of 12 holidays per year. And you might wonder, how did we get to that determination of saying that that might be something to agree to? We looked at the comparables, and we noticed that there has been a trend with our comparables to be adding a second floating holiday. Not only in just the comparables for this group, but back in 2016 when we negotiated with the Teamsters, that was one of their big things, was they wanted that second floating holiday for both of their groups, and we agreed to it at that time. We recently agreed to it for the non-commission contract, so we figured it made sense to agree to it for the commission contract. And this was an easy one for us to also make consistent throughout for all of our work groups, for all of our employees, bargaining unit or non-bargaining unit. So we recently also updated our employee policy manual to include that second float holiday. We added officer in charge pay for patrol only. This is considered a shift differential, basically, of $35 per day for over half a normal shift or more. This is very specific to our staffing needs. When we do not have a sergeant on shift at that time, this puts a police officer into that officer in charge role. And I know that Chief Dresker will be able to answer more questions about the specific specialty pays if you have those in a moment. The other specialty pays that we added one for field training officer. We briefly spoke about this when we brought forward the non-commissioned contract. Field training officer is basically a program that we have where our experienced officers have been trained to become an FTO, to basically train our newly hired officers to become independent and to become operational on their own. It's a good way to make sure that we have a mentor type program going on, and it's also a really good way to ensure that our onboarding process is going to make longevity and long-term success with our employees. If you orient people well, they usually have a good success rate of staying longer. So we really feel like FTO is a special one for us to add. And when we looked at our comparables, we noticed that all of our comparables looked like they felt the same way. You can see the percentages that our comps were offering and the same type of language when they are assigned to a specific new officer and they're training them. They are responsible and accountable and taking a little bit more liability on. So we tentatively agreed to a 2% base pay when training that assigned officer. And then the last two specialty pays that we discussed and tentatively agreed to were the high-risk entry team, which is like your SWAT team, and then detectives. We specifically agreed to the detective specialty pay with addition that they would be subject to an on-call schedule rotation. So there are some very specific details that we wanted to be attached to that specialty pay for the detectives. And when we looked at our comps, we noticed that a lot of cities, we all hire police officers, and we don't really have the ability or the need to hire a full-time school resource officer or a full-time detective or a full-time training officer. A lot of times you just have your police officer classifications, and then if there's additional roles and responsibilities, they are being given specialty pays is what we've been seeing in our comps. And so you can kind of see at the top the percentages that the comparables are doing, and then you can see down below the different position titles that they have in their buckets. And we are looking at adding high-risk entry team and detectives. We also told the association that we would only be able to look at some sort of type of graduated scale to get them to be where they would like to be in relation to their comps. So we've tentatively agreed to a 1%, 2%, and 3% spread out over the 3 terms of that contract agreement. And then the last piece is the costing of the contract. So I think I've shared this with you, and I know it's been in the council packet, but you can see at the top the market adjustment for 2018. Well, I guess you can first see the 2017 budget, and then the adjustment for 2018, COLA for 2019 and 20. And then if you go down to the next section, you'll see the specialty pays being added in, and at the very bottom, you'll see the final costing impact. So in summary, I wanted to just let you know that it does feel like our internal labor relations team is working. I came on board in 2016, and I think that was a new process for us to be building an internal labor relations team, and I feel like it is getting to be a very successful process for us. There's definitely some areas that we need to focus on in developing our long-term negotiation strategy, because there are 5 different union contracts with different requests. And then it's also important for HR to kind of have a little bit perspective of priorities so that we know how to manage the entire workforce from some sort of consistent perspective for the city. There's a couple of goals that we'll be looking at, of course, and that's just short-term, long-term, being mindful of what's happening with recruitment and retention, and continuing to try to be successful in the bargaining process. So now it's your turn for questions.
Councilor Wassinger.
Sure. I have a few.
Yeah.
And so maybe I won't take all the air right off the bat if somebody wants to jump in. But who did the comps for the market adjustment of the base salary?
So
The comp study,
Yeah.
excuse me.
So the comps were actually agreed upon during the negotiation process. So the first meeting, the two meetings that you have with the union, you both bring in your different list of comps that you feel should be looked at. And then there's usually a process of eliminating 2 or 3 comps from either side so that you get a set number that you both agree on. So it came from both the management side team and the association agreeing upon that as part of negotiations.
Is that something that the public can see? That we could see as council
With the
members?
notes or who
Or
they
just
are?
Who they are,
Yeah,
you know.
definitely.
Okay.
The comps that we used were for this group, and of course they are different for each group. This group was Anacortes, Arlington, and if I say something wrong, I apologize in advance.
Okay.
Des Moines, Lake Stevens, Mount Vernon, Mount Lake Terrace, and Mukilteo. Did I say it right?
Uh-huh, you got it.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
And the 2.5 COLA, that is not subject to any adjustment for any market inflation. That is just set at 2.5.
Yeah, there was
5%.
actually a lot of discussions because some of our comps do set their COLA based on a certain percentage of the CPI. We went back and forth as to whether we wanted to leave it open to a certain percentage based on the CPI, and we really wanted to be a set percentage so that we knew it wouldn't fluctuate.
Okay. So was Patricia involved in the negotiations of these up until the end?
Yes.
Because for me, if you look at our city's general fund budget, which thank you is online now for the public to see, for anyone to see, I appreciate that. It's very easy to read. For the general fund, my concern is the beginning of fund balances in that fund have continued to decrease year after year for several years now, especially since 2015. I mean, we had 2.8 million and now adopted we're down to 1.9. So my concern is in agreeing to any ongoing increase in an expenditure in our general fund, what is that trend going to be? And Patricia, maybe you could answer this. What are we looking like heading into the budget cycle when we have to make, set priorities, and we have a lot of safety and important, our goals to meet? Are we going to be able to do this in the general fund?
So what I can say is I know what the impact will be in 18. We have an estimated impact for 19 and 20, but we haven't started doing revenue projections yet. And sometimes when you get into this, I could predict that we'll be fine, but I don't want to say that until we actually get into the meat of the revenue projections. So I don't want to say we're fine or we're not fine. I do know that I compared what I had actually costed out for different ones, and so like the non-rep, the impact to general fund is going to be $109,000. The commissioned is at $79,000 for 18, and then the non-commissioned is $30,000. So for a total of $219,000. I know we've had an increase in revenue.
119.
To 109, 79, and a 30 is, I included the non, so the salary survey, salary comp study. Those are the ones I know about that will impact our budget. So it's 219, 246. For the police only, it's about 109. Okay, so when I looked at that, then I looked at currently where we're at. We're currently closing the year. We've increased revenues by more than that at this point, but all the accruals aren't done, so I don't have final numbers to tell you that. I do know we have a fund balance, so it's not as if we won't be able to pay people's salaries. how we work on that, though, going forward, that's one of the things that Emma alluded to. We're talking that it would be really good before we go into negotiations to get council guidance on what you would like us to try to stick to. But as Emma was explaining, there's also the comparables we have to look at. So when we came to the 2.25 COLA, that was looking at what other comparables we're talking about doing for their staff, and then also looking at the CPI and trying to make sure we made a prudent choice on those.
So in summary, just so I know that I got like the important or pieces that I was looking for,
Okay.
you feel that our revenues going forward are looking like they are going to increase in the general fund?
This year, they went up.
2018?
2000
From 17
2017 to 18,
our
we have
revenue.
excess revenue over expenditures.
Now, are you including the sales tax from the wastewater treatment plant when you say that?
I am, but we've also transferred out sales tax from the wastewater treatment
Okay.
plant in excess of what we've identified
Still-
that belongs to Hoffman or one of the other contractors. So we're trying to keep that straight. We actually are taking a look at that to make sure. But it did go up more than just the treatment plant.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
That's all I have for now, thank you.
But whether that trend continues or not, I won't
Yeah.
say yes.
Thank you, Mayor. So I'm going to segue on that, whether that trend continues or not, that's a bump in our sales tax. The wastewater treatment plant has a big impact on not just Oak Harbor, but the other taxing agencies, the county, Island
Yes.
Transit, et cetera. And for the Island County Transit, we have set aside that bump, recognizing that it's an anomaly in our planning right now. I don't want to be going down that road counting on that money as what our future is. So guidance from this council member
Okay?
is, this is the problem that I have with this. Strategy is part of putting together an agreement and comparing it to our budget. So far this year, we have approved, before the budget, correct me if I'm wrong, we've approved a lieutenant for the fire department. Fire department had some issues that they wanted met, we approved those. Just last meeting, we approved paid on call for fire department. We haven't even started the budget process yet. We haven't started the budget process, yet we're negotiating with the unions. We don't even know what we're able to pay. We don't know what the trend is right now. So I can understand the need for the fire department. They have their own special need. Public Works has their special need. Planning development, community development. Steve Powers smiles over there. He has his special needs. We have to negotiate based on what our needs are as the general fund, as the community. So I'm more inclined to say, let's get our budget trend, our revenue trends established so we really feel comfortable where we are before we continue with giving 4% raises in 2018, 19, and 20 to the police department at this time. Thank you, Mayor.
Councilor. Thank you. I'll just reiterate what they both said. There's not a lot to add there. My concern would be, we talked about it when we did the market rate study. And my comments at that time, just backing up a little bit, is if we don't have people that retire or leave, I was very concerned where that was leading us. And when we look at something like this and these numbers, I remain concerned. I absolutely appreciate what these folks do and that we want to retain. It's cheaper to retain an employee than to attract a new one. I would be curious, Patricia, as we kind of what Councilmember Allenberg hinted at, looking at historic revenue growth. Anytime I see a number north of 2%, I don't know if our general fund is growing at more than 2%, and that's how we have to pay for this.
Yes.
And Mayor, you're going to have your hands full with this budget cycle, but it's the one after this one that really concerns me as we see the effect of all of this. So I'd like to see, and also maybe some comparables. When we mentioned cities like Anacortes or Mount Vernon or Burlington especially, we don't have the same economic drivers that they have as far as petroleum plants or water plants and some of those 3 or 4 marinas. So I think it would be very interesting if we got a glimpse of their general fund. And if we're doing comparables, we're trying to, how do I say this? We're trying to keep up with the Joneses And I understand why, but if our general fund doesn't have a chance of keeping up with the Joneses, how do we pay for this long term? Because it's hard to go backwards. So I would be interested in some of that information as well to help reconcile whether, where we go from here. Thank you.
I'll get that for you.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Everybody deserves raises and stuff, but sometimes it appears in our past history that the first group to get in and negotiate gets it, and the last group in gets nothing. And then they fall really far behind, and it doesn't seem fair.
Right.
If you're trying to, all of it. I think Councilman Almberg had a good point about we have a bump, and so some of the other groups he's working with, they take that bump and they're taking it out of the equation because it won't be there next year. And so work with what we know we're gonna have. This is kind of like an extra fun, but if we count on that and then next year, the 2019 just slips down, then everybody loses. So the fire department is now cutting an employee, or the police department's cutting, or someone is getting hacked off because they're the last one to be hired. And that doesn't help our city as far as safety or keeping things running. So
Right.
I don't know the answers, but I get nervous when, you have a windfall and you spend the windfall and then the windfall isn't there.
And I can answer that question.
okay.
When we did our projections for revenues for sales tax, we didn't include what we thought would be in the treatment plant. We also actually moved that money out of general fund into the treatment plant fund. So we moved $825,000 worth of sales tax revenue over to the treatment plant out of general fund. So that bump really isn't sitting in general fund, and it's not something we've been counting on.
Okay. I just get worried, but I also get worried that if you're the last one on the totem pole to come up for your negotiations, whatever period is, and then they lose out, because that has happened not just once, but it has happened a lot of times. And I'm sorry, we need to try to stay fair. We owe it to all our employees.
Yes.
And they're all important, and I can't, sometimes I may feel like one is more important at the time because of something that happened, but we need to stay fair.
Yes.
I just think that's being prudent and what we're trying to do. So
Yeah. Thank you.
no answers, just my concerns. Thank you.
I just have a quick question about the COLA. You talked about the difference between having a fixed COLA and the CPI and its inherent fluctuation. I like things being steady and predictable just as much as the next person, but when it comes to a COLA, why would we choose not to go with a fluctuating number that more accurately reflects what the economy is doing? So I'm wondering if you could speak to why we went with that fixed COLA.
I really can't probably answer that question because I don't know the history as to why all of the history of our contracts have been set percentages. I'm not sure why the history in our contracts hasn't been based on a CPI.
So to speak to that to a certain percentage, so if you take a chance, if you settle with 2.25 for our COLA that we're doing for the next 3 years, you take a chance that if something tanks in the CPI and it goes down to 1, but we're paying 1.25 above what that CPI would have been if we agreed on a CPI. However, we're also setting it so that if the CPI goes to 3.5, we're still locked in at 2.25. So there is a little bit of a gamble, so to speak, but it's a reasonable factor that you're trying to set it at. And then it's also for planning purposes for those 3 years, you don't have to look to that CPI every year. You can plan out for that 3-year period of time, that known amount of money, that known percentage, if the contract is 3 years. You're not looking to that next year to see, oh, what's CPI? It's a known factor. So the key is, or the work is trying to figure out what that factor is that's equitable and doable by the city and still, with the association coming to agreement. So that's some of the tactics behind that, or why you might want to do that. If you don't, then you're looking at that CPI if you're doing those contracts. So some contracts will go, 100% of CPI the next year, or 75%, or 1.25% of the CPI. And so you can do the different strategies, but if you have it, you know it. It doesn't matter what CPI is. You're locked in. That's the strategy portion of it.
Thank you, Chief.
That's an excellent question, I think. And it sounds like some are tied to CPI.
Yeah, there
Is
are.
that the case?
Yeah, there are
Yeah.
definitely
Sure,
contracts and comps
sure,
that do it.
okay, yeah, okay. Did
No,
you
I just
guys,
want to follow up with that. What I would like to see us track though then is, in 3 years when we're up for this, I would like to be able to see what the CPI was and has been historically, so that
Sure.
as we're looking at this next time, we could say, okay, this is what the CPI did, this is where that 2.25%, where would they have evened out? We're just looking to be equitable with what's coming in versus what's going out.
Sure.
Thank you.
so, the department heads do get to hear from me about their budgets and my concern about how they manage their departments and where they're at with their budget. Believe me, they get to hear about it, and it's obviously a concern when we have, a process like this that's potentially going to affect their budget. I think the chief may have, some even more discussion before we're done here about that. I don't know. I mean, I think that he's got a pretty good understanding of his budget, what this might do, what he might, do or not do. But believe me, when we go into deciding on our next budget, if we decide, if you decide to go ahead with this, and this is a, and this is what the city has decided to do, but it is up to the council. If it gets changed, it could affect the budget, obviously, in one way or another. If it's left like it is, we'll have to put it into the budget and figure out what that really means. Does that mean we have to cut down on workforce in some way? We'll have to decide that. But I think the chief has got a pretty good grip on his budget, and I don't know whether you want to speak to that at this point in time, or?
I can if you'd like me to. So I know that if we accept this contract that's proposed for 2018, it's an additional 110,000 that I've got to come up with this year or overrun. And I came in under budget last year at around, I think, 130 or something. There's some invisible money that comes back to the city that doesn't come back to my budget. But contrary to that, I've already told the mayor if this goes through, I'll work extremely hard, and I said I will come in under budget still. And without predicting the future, I know there's some changes or some things I'm going to do with internally. Like not fill a spot, something like that, to keep a budget underneath and within our budget, if need be. We'll cut back here and there. We're revamping our training program, so we're doing more training inside, a little less outside. We've entered into an MOU with the association regarding some training costs to reduce our costs. So we're looking at all sorts of things within our department for efficiencies. It's not tied to the contract. We were looking at it already anyways. And so I will do my best, and I feel pretty comfortable that I'll come in at or under budget. Not a promise, but that's my goal, and as I look ahead, I think I can do that. Of course, as we go into budget talks for 2019 and 2020, it's, we've got to discuss the whole thing there anyways. Like any other department, I'm just going to say I'm pretty adamant I don't want to lose officers, so as far as staffing wise, we're down to 26. This department was at 29 about 8 years ago. I've pulled up the data. We've been at 26 for a long time. I think we're bare minimum right now. We've been running short because of hiring and stuff like that. That's always a struggle for police departments. So typically you can run 1 or 2 below depending upon where your staffing gets up to. So the 26 we haven't even been running at. But I do feel comfortable pulling in under budget this year, even if we go with this contract. I can speak to, if you want, why the specialty pays are there, or at least what those positions are. I even have some handouts. If you don't know, you may know by looking at it what they're all about. If you don't, I wanted to educate you on it. I'm happy to do that. The base salary, the 2.25%, that's a fiscal thing. That's not tied to specialty pay. That's just contract negotiations. Specialty pay has some specific meaning to interdepartmental working, so operational stuff. So I'm happy to speak to that if you want or not.
Councilor Watson.
Yes, so just a question on your officer numbers. So in 18, we adopted for you to have $484,000 in expenditures. Was that adopted with 26 officers in mind, or are you looking to add more still? What has been what's been budgeted for versus what you've actually had as far as actual officer numbers? Do you know that off?
You're first part, I wasn't sure what you're meaning by that, but I can tell you that historically, that Oak Harbor Police Department has had, and I pulled the numbers, it's at least the last seven years, I think, we've had 26 commissioned officers. There was at one time 29.
So are you, so you're at 26 now?
Our 26th person, is coming on with us on April
Oh, okay.
16th. Our top levels for commissioned officers is 26. I'm not looking to increase that. I mean, if you guys want to give me more, that's
So
fine.
you're, well,
no,
but
I'm
you're not gonna look to that, ask us that in the budget cycle coming up? for-
Kevin wasn't here during that budget cycle.
Okay.
So, but we did budget fully for full staff, so
Of
even out,
26.
yeah, if there were vacant positions, they were budgeted as if they were to be filled.
And you're anticipating to continue that same number of officer trend going forward here in our next budget cycle for 19 and 20? Are you looking for
With 26 officers, yes, I'd be looking not to reduce that. I mean,
Okay.
obviously, I could always use more, but I know the realism of the budget. And so I'm not gonna come to you and ask you for additional, but I do want the 26.
And then, does that include a school resource officer? How do you staff your school resource officer? Because I know that maybe this isn't the right discussion, but if this in any way impacts that, it's important to me that we continue to have a school resource officer in place. I think, and for my opinion, that needs to remain a priority in our police department. So how does that affect that position?
We've been staffing a school resource officer. I don't know if the city has done it forever. They did it with a different model about 8 years ago. That model changed as far as how that fiscally was done to a certain extent. We've been staffing it. I know before I got here, the school resource officer was pulled because of staffing concerns, which is also part of the reason why we've got to keep 26 because we've been running short. I know he was pulled. I pulled the SRO this year for 1 month as I was doing some staffing reallocations and stuff. But otherwise, we've had that SRO. There are some fiscal models out there that we explore, and we are exploring to see, is there a better fiscal model for everybody involved? And so that's something that we'll consistently explore as part of our efficiencies and how is it best to fund different things. So I don't have any plans at this point to just yank a school resource officer out of a school or out of the school district. We will continue to support that. How exactly that looks going forward, commitment-wise, is something we're always looking at.
Councilor Sebelius.
So just to decipher that answer, we're essentially paying for the school resource officer predominantly.
We are at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, 100%.
Okay.
Councilor Almer.
Thank you, Mayor. Chief Dresser, you referred to your budget about saving, for whatever reason or method, you managed to save over $100,000. I would like to see that information in writing. I don't just trust your word. I'd like to see that information in writing to finance. I would also like to see the other negotiating team, the department heads like fire and public works that are represented, to see what their budget savings are or their forwarding balances
So,
to finance so that we know where we are. I'm not prepared to approve increases ahead of our budget cycle unless finance knows where we are in terms of our revenue and where the starting point is on this. It seems like we're being asked to approve something that we don't know if we have the money for it.
can I quantify on
Yes.
being able to provide numbers? We're currently in the process of closing the year. So that means we're accruing things and we're recording prepaids, making sure everything's correct. So whatever number that's in the system right now may not be the number that goes onto our financial report. So I would caution that we say that number is solid until the year is closed. We can get close, but we can't say it's 100% accurate because there's still steps that are happening to record allocation shares of different things, indirect costs, all of that stuff's still being done and will be done by the end of April, mid-April probably, to be able to be posted to the state auditor's office. So I always caution, the final numbers that'll be published will be of the closed numbers for the year, and the year is not officially closed.
So until we get to that deadline, are you able to project where we are going to
I
be?
can get us close.
Revenues and specs.
Yes,
within 2.5%?
yes, but it's not gonna be the final totals.
I understand
Okay,
that.
I just
can
wanna
live with
quantify that.
Right now, I don't have anything.
And just to clarify that too, I didn't mean that as a predictor for the future. Yet last year was, I think, a little bit of a rarity year for us with some staffing and that we weren't able to fill and stuff. So that's where I was able to do some things, and we were improving. It was my first year here. We were improving some training, some equipment, some stuff like that. So in no way do I mean that that's a predictor that I'm going to save 100,000 this year. I would expect, and I would always say to you, I'll come in at budget. If I come in under, great, but we want to come in at budget. Sometimes you run over budget. You know, I'm not an exception to the rule from anybody else, but my goal is always, here's my budget, that's what I got to operate with.
And sometimes do you hedge in your budget when you're preparing your budget?
Hedge in my budget? No, I try to predict it for what it actually is. The hedging part for police and for fire and other places is you got to try to predict overtime. I mean, some of that kind of stuff you've got training, overtime, some of those things that are non-predictable. You've got to try to put, and I wouldn't call it
There
hedge.
could be a major event that happens
Correct.
that changes the whole thing.
Correct. You've got to try to keep enough in there.
I'm more comfortable with this process when we have a simultaneous negotiation, so we know pretty close to where we're going to be relative to what we know about the budget. I can't make it any more clear, say any more about that.
I guess the only thing I have a little concern about is we have a plan to bring this to a council meeting. Is that
We
correct?
did. Yes, we were planning to bring it to council for action.
So I guess if city council wants
More information.
more information or, I don't know, options or anything different, now would be a good time to, and I think I'm hearing that. And so I guess I don't know, you know, tell us what you'd like, and or I don't know whether there's any time to wait any longer. Councilor Wassmer?
Oh, I'm sorry, yes, what, so we have a meeting, were you hoping April 2nd or 16th?
Whichever day would work best if we need some
Or
time.
17th, excuse me.
Yeah, we can put it on any agenda. We were hoping on April 3rd, but definitely if we need some time to bring
Well,
back more
if-
information.
Yeah, if Patricia,
We can
it's
change the
easier
date.
for Patricia if we wait till the 17th. So that way that you can get us some more close, because that's even closer to your closing out the year
Yeah,
end.
we're in the process of doing it now, so.
Yeah.
So
We'll
even,
have more.
I think for me, the 17th may be better, and that way Patricia can provide us with a little more solid numbers for how 17 ended and going in, and we can compare that and
Yeah.
see what trend.
Can I restate what I've heard so far?
Mhm.
So you're looking for a historical, are you guys thinking 5-10-year historical on revenue and expenditure differences? What do you think would be helpful?
For me, coming out of the recession, 10 years would be handy because we're
Okay.
10 years out.
All right. And then closer total budgets by department.
And the timing for simultaneous negotiation with the other representative unions. I hate to do one at a time. Why can't we have, first of all, excuse me, I should ask permission to speak. Why is this urgent that has to be signed or approved in April? Don't we need time to come to an agreement with the other unions?
Each union has their own timeline. And so every union, once you get the notice to bargain or negotiate, you start that process. And if it takes 6 months, 9 months to go through all of the proposals and terms, there is no specific rush at this time to get this approved. It's just that we're at the point of feeling like we were done with negotiations and the association membership voted. And so now that's just the process that we've been taking, is to bring it to council next. But it's not urgent to be done in April.
So what's the timeline with the Teamsters and the firefighters?
So we're just now starting to talk about comparables, and we're planning to hopefully schedule our first meetings after spring, because we want to start negotiating by the end of summer. Because their contracts expire by December 31st
Of this year.
of this year, those
So
three.
it's not urgent. Maybe we have time to meet those those dates with the other
The only
unions.
thing that I would say is urgent is for the chief to be able to implement some of these changes that we have tentatively agreed to in order to better manage his workforce. That might be the only urgency. The association, of course, would be open to our communication if we need more time for more information. They would obviously need to know if we need to go back to the table to continue to negotiate.
At this time, I don't have, for me, again, I have an issue with what you have tentatively agreed to.
Right.
My issue is, do we have the ability to pay in the course of negotiating with the other departments?
Right.
That, there's nothing else for me to say. I'm not in a hurry to wrap this up. I'm more interested in wrapping up a package with all of the represented employees.
Yes.
And like Pro Tem Munn said, you know, we want to be equitable. We can't have a double-tiered system, you know, when people have comparable job positions, et cetera, et cetera. There has to be some equitability in it, in addition to our ability to pay, not
Yes.
necessarily because some other more wealthy community can
Right.
pay, but within our ability to pay. And we don't know that until we get the finance information and until we come to a tentative agreement with the other members.
Just one last thought, if there are sidebar, if there's two more at least coming, I know in the past, I think it was Braun was the gentleman's name.
Bob Braun was
Bob
used
Braun.
in the past, yes.
So we would go into executive session, we'd have some of this process explained, we would at least have some idea of what proposals might be. And I think that was helpful for
That's
this,
good to know.
for the council to go through that process
Yeah.
in executive session, and then be able to come out and have a follow-on discussion. So moving forward, that might, for me, that would be helpful
good.
before, I mean, because either way, we're seeing it not for the first time, but essentially for the first time, and to make a decision at the next meeting for me is a little quick.
That would be great. I would agree to do that.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. Chief, before you came, Chief Gallagher did an end-of-the-year report, and I was astounded at some of the, I'll term it archaic equipment we were still using and so far behind, and how some evidence was getting, I guess, messed up because we didn't have the proper equipment. Have you been able to do any of those things that we need to kind of bring the department up? And I think having that type of equipment also puts the pride and understanding that we're backing your officers by having some of that equipment. You can't have it all, but I was just astounded.
Yeah, and I can answer that if you like.
Okay,
So,
please.
Yeah, and it, you know, I live in the police world, so of course I'm pro-police. But, you know, it's a complex world, and there's recent legislation that just passed, if you're not aware, 940, I think, and 1003, I think is the number, which may look at other requirements for us that we have to do. Good thing about it is we're, Washington State as a whole and Oak Harbor are set for that. We're already doing almost everything that's there. As part of my goals in coming in addition to just working on the complete organizational culture with the police department, and our police department has been fantastic with accepting that, has been to improve equipment, facility as much as we can, training, community outreach. You know, we're reaching out to the schools, and so some of those specific things that Chief Gallagher had talked about, the evidence drying lockers, what you're I think referring to, we've purchased that. We had the capital budget for it, we purchased it. So that's set up. We've improved our process in the evidence room and established an evidence tech and improved that process. We purchased a lot of equipment last year. We've got new desks in our squad room, makes it more of a livable environment, more efficient for them, some new chairs. So we've been working on all that stuff, which is we've had some budget from last year because we were down staffing, that we were able to do some of that. Some of our firearms in our use of force training program, we've been spending some money and getting our defensive tactics instructor built up. There's money that you got to spend for training. We purchased some equipment in that. So we have made a lot of inroads in that. There's still, you know, with a building like that, we still have stuff to do, but I think we've come a long way, and it's totality, and even with this stuff, with the specialty pays, this is stuff that a lot of people are doing, and it's a totality, like you said, with police officers, because you want people to be happy where they're working. You want to provide them the resources. We want to maintain this as a competitive, not competitive, I guess you could use that word, modern police department as much as we can to attract and keep the personnel, the quality personnel who are out there working with our community. So we've been working hard at that. There's always room to move forward. I think council's been very supportive of that in the past, and I understand the complexities of what Councilman Allenberger is saying, and I don't disagree with that. I think what we're looking at with these things, and there's only really one piece on here that waiting a couple months or something from my perspective is something that is something that I don't really want to see, but that may be something we can work on a temporary MOU on with the association to make it in progress. It's an internal operational thing, and I'm talking about the officer in charge system. It's just, it's minimal, and if it's an MOU, it's just temporary until we decide where we're going to go as a council, as a contract. The association's been very agreeable working with us on almost everything since I've been here. We've entered into a couple of MOUs for other things like training, different things like that, which has saved the city money and enhanced our ability to provide the training to the officers, increasing our hours, increasing our readiness. So I think I understand the complexities of the city and the different contracts. So we have made inroads. That's the short answer.
All right, good, thank you.
Anything else? Okay. Thank you very much, Emma, Chief. We will move on to Development Services. Looks like we have our Development Service Director, Mr. Powers, Steve Powers.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. I'll be short as I can for you this afternoon. This is a continuation of our conversation about potential Garry oak tree protection standards. So quickly, you probably recall that last summer you adopted a code that made some adjustments in how we dealt with setbacks and variances around oak trees, and the idea was to be more flexible and help protect oak trees in that particular kind of situation. During that conversation with you, the Garry Oak Society brought forward some great public comment. They suggested to the council that you consider strengthening your standards during construction around Garry oak trees. And specifically, our existing code used a phrase which was fairly flexible from one perspective, but lacked direction from another perspective, and that was that during building or construction operations, suitable protective barriers should be erected. And there was some conversation about, well, what does that really mean? How do we apply it, et cetera. And so we've had a couple of workshops with you to get a little more direction from you. Were you interested in more general standards being included in the code? Did you want to see us go to a more prescriptive approach? What we think we heard from you was to use more of a prescriptive approach. These are the things that the applicant shall do during construction when an oak tree is involved. And so what I have for you this afternoon then is a first cut at a draft ordinance that tries to incorporate the comments that we've heard from council before. We definitely have relied upon some of the information that the Garry Oak Tree Society has shared with us, and I think shared with the council as well. I think I have way more copies than we need there, but and so what we've done is to, in the section of the code which is in chapter 2016, oak tree protection, as you can see, we've used the legislative edit version for you, or technique for you. Item 2 under 20.16.010 used to just say, during building or construction operations, suitable protective barriers shall be erected around oak trees and shrubs which may be subject to injury. So, rather than rely on that general statement, there are 9 or 10 more prescriptive ideas here that we could put into the code. And it really centers around the idea of a critical root zone. And again, I'd like to give credit to the society for sharing that thought with us. We've often looked at things in terms of drip lines and how do we protect trees from a drip line perspective. This information is something that is a little more advanced than that. And these are excerpt slides from some information that was shared with Kat Kamak, who's actually our project lead on this. And rather than focus on the drip line, the idea of a critical root zone really looks at the specific tree and its diameter, and then establishing a barrier around that tree based upon that concept of a critical root zone. And these are just 3 of the slides out of a fairly lengthy presentation, but you can see definitionally what it means through that sketch. There are some examples why this makes a little more sense than working with drip lines, because trees can be at angles, they can be in unusual sets of circumstances. And the last page shows you a plan view of how you would see that critical root zone applied. And what we've incorporated into the code is the one which would set the perimeter critical root zone, so the one that we believe would provide the maximum protection. And that's one radius, so it's 1 foot for every 1 inch of diameter of that tree. So that's the first one. The second link, so you figure out what that zone is, then you protect it with a strong fence. You post signage on there so it's clear to the workmen on the site that we're protecting that area. Then we move into what happens subsurface. No roots greater than 4 inches should be cut, even if they are outside of the critical root zone. They very specifically say that all necessary cuts to roots shall be done with sharp tools rather than just sort of hacking at it with the backside of your pick. Construction debris or stockpile construction materials shall be done away from the tree. Somewhat of a common sense, but we've put that in the code to make sure it's very clear. Talking about not disturbing the soil composition around the critical root zone, in or around it. We're avoiding the change of soil grades around the tree, and when we're doing that, we're doing it in a gradual fashion. And then making sure that we're basically trying to keep contaminants away from that tree as much as possible during the construction process. So the goal of this afternoon was just to share this with you, maybe get a general idea if you think this is headed in the right direction. If it is, we'll peel off and start our process with the Planning Commission. And then as our normal case, we would brief them on it, then we would conduct a public hearing, and then we'd be back to the council for adoption of the code. That's it.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you. Mr. Powers, on the tree trimming, Puget Power can be very aggressive, and I don't know if they always get permits. They just start going through and they just hack. And the tree looks hacked and may or may not ever come back. So it says that they should apply, trimming shall be granted when permitted. And, you know, the thing that got me was utility lines over the right of way. So I don't know how you can prevent them from just hacking other than if someone sees something and they call in. But it's just a shame. Sometimes I've seen some really gorgeous trees, and having gone through master gardeners at one point in my time, that they just go whack. And it's like, really? That was a tree? So I'm just,
A lot of times it has to do with the people involved.
Yes.
If they sub that out, some of their subs really understand that they need to be working with us. I think it also has to do with the PSE personnel. If that stays consistent, then we build up that working relationship. But I think actually PSE understands that Garry oak trees are different than the non-Garry oak trees in the right of way. So I think we can say we have more success with them than we have failures.
okay. I just remember the poor tree by Kmart that they wanted to read the sign. Anyway,
Yes.
that took a long time to resolve, it seemed like, and I felt sorry for the city trying to get through. Anyway, it was an interesting situation at the time for months.
Well, it is, and as you put your
Yeah.
finger on a challenging thing, when you cut a tree, once you cut the tree, you know, it's done. And so we work really hard to make sure that people understand before they start those maintenance activities.
All right, thank you. I just had to put the word in.
Yeah, appreciate that.
You're making me go back to elementary math. So what is the average radius of an oak tree? Or I mean diameter, excuse me. What is the average diameter? I'm just trying to think. I mean, I know if you look at the the slice at Smith Park, I mean, that oak tree was massive. I mean, I assume they're not all that many inches in diameter.
Some of them are rather large.
So what are you thinking, 3 feet in diameter? I mean, 2?
I think they vary, and I think that's maybe the applicability of the standard is that it will vary based upon the tree.
So if you have, I just spatially, I'm trying to think of all the Garry oak trees that I've come across. If you have one that's even like 2 feet, that's so 200 and some feet, right? That you would need to have a circular area around. So it's a foot for every inch in diameter. So if you had a 24-inch,
So it's a 24-inch, and it's 1 foot radius, so that would be 24 feet.
okay, so 24 feet is, yeah, 24 feet. So that would be
Radius,
like,
so that'd be 48 feet total.
okay. Thank you for helping me with that.
Sure, sure.
And then some of this to me is a little bit like subjective maybe, which is maybe I'm just trying to at this time think about these actual like people that are having to do construction or businesses or homeowners. Post signage to help convey the importance of CRZ to workers. Is there like a standard sign? Is there some sort of, are you gonna say here's a sign, like, I mean, or here's what you need to, or do you just want them to maybe post this? I don't want it to become an issue of, well, what's good enough for a sign to convey the importance? It's a little bit subjective.
I think it's an excellent question, and maybe the only parallel that I can think of right now is that when wetlands are protected at the end of a project and there's usually some sort of split rail fence or something that denotes the boundary of a wetland, there's a standardized language of a sign that goes on there. I think it would be relatively easy for us to develop a standard language and say this is the language that goes on the sign, or on the fence rather.
It might be helpful.
Yeah, I
and
think that's a great comment.
just so that it's not a subjective, he said he did this construction company did this, why, we don't want, I hate
something
to make
more than
something
this is
hard.
important.
Yes, okay, and then no roots greater than 4 inches in diameter shall be cut even if they're outside the CRZ. So I'm not really familiar. Typically they are not 4 inches in diameter. I mean, could you have a 4-inch oak tree root be so far outside of the safe zone that it would, I mean, is that a common occurrence? Are we gonna have trouble with people trying to do improvements to properties because there's a 4-inch root that's 50 feet away?
I don't have a good answer to that question, but I would be happy to get a little research done, and we'll have an answer for that before we come back to you.
Okay, and again, along the same lines, construction debris or stockpile construction material shall be done away from the tree. Again, that's a little bit like how far away?
So the reason we did that,
Uh-huh.
because we had a lot of conversation about that one
Okay.
at staff, is so depending on the lot, depending on where a building is and where a project may be taking place, the tree, a Garry oak tree may be nowhere near where the construction is actually taking place. So setting some sort of physical distance could be more problematic than just saying you should keep it away from there. And so one of the points that Kat Kamak, who does a lot of this permitting for us, made during our conversations is that each property is different.
Yeah.
Right? It could have 1 Garry oak on it, could have 10 Garry oak trees on it. It can be a place that's a large lot with a relatively small home, and they're adding a mudroom on this side of the house, but the Garry oak is way over here. Well, in that case, setting some sort of standard may cause more trouble than it's worth. And so this particular one was left slightly flexible for that very specific reason. But that's also why sort of the catch-all is number 3 down here. And I failed to draw that to your attention. I apologize. What we've said is, okay, number 2 tells you the standards that you need to apply. But if they can't be met because of site-specific situations, or in the case where it's determined that they're not going to do the level of protection that we're interested in, then we are going to require some kind of plan done by a certified arborist. And that's in response to what we think we heard from the council during one of the other conversations, which is, to paraphrase, we thought you were interested in striking a balance between protecting the trees but not necessarily having the private property owner incur too much cost. So the specific standards are try to apply to the vast majority of the circumstances. If they're not going to work, then they say to us, we don't think these are going to work, and we're going to say, okay, that'll give us a specific plan for your property done by the arborist, and we think that's the balance point.
Thank you.
Councilor Alberg.
So the city has utilities they have to replace, repair in the right of way, but it happens to be under the drip line, and we have several trees that are actually, there's one in the right of way that I can think of right now. So how do we mitigate that if we have to deal with utilities and we are really going very near the tree that's in the right of way? What is the city's
So there are
decision?
two big ways that we approach that. The first is we work really hard to follow our own rules. Okay, so if we're going to require Mr. and Mrs. homeowner to follow these rules, Kathy's staff works very hard to follow the same ones when we're undertaking that work. There is the second piece of that is that in the critical areas regulations, the general regulations which apply to all critical areas, of which Garry Oaks are one, there is a special exception for public utilities if that impact can't be avoided. And then we would address that particular circumstance in light of that piece of code. But our first step is always, let's follow the same rules, but there is a special exception for public utilities because of the importance of those facilities.
So if you're replacing or putting in new sidewalks, let's say we do a LID and we have improvements going down each side of the street, we have sidewalks going in there, so that we will disturb a lot of areas where there are Garry Oaks that are going to be within the drip line. So then that scenario applies to the exceptions under critical areas?
I don't know that we consider sidewalks to be a public utility in the sense of what I think the code means. I think the code is talking more about water and sewer and storm drain lines and potentially other public utilities not provided by the city of Oak
Well,
Harbor.
let's say we have a project to do a street improvement that includes curb gutter and walks, and it happens to be within that area. I mean, that could happen.
It certainly could. I mean, that would all be part of the scoping for that particular project.
Okay.
And I think that what's different there is you're talking about a public project. And so what we're going to be able to bring to bear in looking at that problem and coming up with design alternatives and potentially using different kinds of pavement or different kinds of construction techniques, those are techniques or skills or approaches that probably your average homeowner isn't going to be able to bring to bear on their single lot project.
Well, I'm not going to give you 50 scenarios about how this can have tripwires in it, because there's going to be some of those in here. But we have also regulations where if somebody's doing a project, they have to do connecting sidewalks from their street frontage, and they're going to disturb the ground in that area. That is an exception
I think
in that scenario?
With respect, I think you're maybe missing the point of what this particular code was intended to do. What we were asked to do by council was to come back with more specific standards to help protect Garry Oak trees. And so that's what we've done this afternoon for you. And that's why we've had the conversations with council to figure out whether you were interested in going to specific standards or staying more generalized. If council's not comfortable with that, then we can vary the path that we're on. I can think of a specific example where we had a Garry Oak tree, and we worked with that particular home builder to change the alignment of the sidewalk and so that it stayed outside of the drip line. And so that's a kind of thing that we were able to do in that particular instance. I think that the vast majority of time these standards apply when somebody is adding the bedroom to their house,
Sure.
right? I mean, we don't have a lot of vacant lots that have Garry Oak trees on them. I mean, we all know where they're at. We all know that it's in the older part of town, and it's in a developed part of town. So I think the vast majority of time, what you're going to see are people wanting to pave the driveway that has been broken up over time, or never was paved in the first place, or they're adding a garage that they didn't have before. Those are the kind of circumstances that we're gonna be dealing with most often, Mr. Alberg.
Okay.
But again, if these are too far afield for the council's interest, then that's also what this conversation is about.
I'm supportive of what you have presented, provided that there are exceptions for common sense situations. And I know you can't necessarily legislate that.
Well, to be honest, the challenging part though is when we go to a list of things that you have to do. By its very nature, the list becomes inclusive.
Yeah.
And if it's not on the list, then we have a hard time saying that that's an option available to us. And that's why the existing language, which says suitable protective barriers, while one might see it as vague, it also provides flexibility. And that gives staff and the applicant greater discretion to figure those things out. But that's not the impression that we got from the council as terms of your desire. So what we've come up with is a list of things that you have to do. If that doesn't work, or if you say as an applicant, that doesn't work for me, then your option is to get a plan prepared by an arborist. And then we've got a certified professional, because we're not Garry oak tree specialists. You have a certified professional telling you these are the things that you need to do to protect this tree or trees during this construction project.
Councilor Sabedi.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to say thank you, well, staff, obviously I support this. I know we got fairly prescriptive here, but I think it's important. This is our namesake. That's what we're named after. So while there's the challenge of over legislating, in this instance, I think it's important because we're protecting our namesake. And I always want to thank Laura and all the work that the Garry Oak Society does. I wish I could live another 80 or 100 years to see all of these oaks, grow up and be big. Maybe we will. Who knows?
Why not?
Maybe. I just was reading, I won't go there. So I just appreciate what you have done and just the vision that this organization has for our city. So I will support this. I know it's fairly prescriptive and it's a change from what we've traditionally done, but I think in this case it's appropriate.
Yes, Councilor Larson.
Thank you, Mayor. We gave you quite a laundry list when we were talking about this the first time around, and I want to reiterate what Councilmember Sabedi says, that this reflects a lot of strong work that you guys have put in to do this, and it covers a lot of the prescriptive things that we had asked for. I understand also in 2C, posting signage, there should be some minimum requirement for language. So I'm not saying that we have to prescribe exactly what it says, but yeah, if we put that in there. But I do like the fact that for some of your concerns as well, Councilman Alberg, in the old number 3, which I assume is number 4 now, where it talks about hard surface areas, and it says to the maximum extent possible. We're not going to put a hard pan or anything like that in those areas, and then talks about there's a realistic exception to that. You may allow hard surface on up to 25%. And then in the new number 3, where it says, should there be a disagreement or miscommunication or a need for clarification, basically the applicant will be required to provide a tree protection plan prepared by a certified arborist. So I think this meets both of the requirements that we had asked you to fulfill, and that is come up with some prescribed methods to protect these trees that isn't going to be prohibitive to development, that's going to be protective of these trees, but also give us some recourse if we believe that maybe someone's not adhering to the letter of the prescription. So I support this as well.
Councilor Wessner.
So maybe number 3 should be probably number 4.
It will, when we work our way, we got some other things to clean up in there.
I guess I didn't notice too. There were 2 number 3s. Okay, thank you.
So the only thing, I think Councilor Wessner was concerned about that circular area a little bit, and I guess if you did have a big oak tree, you conceivably could have one that's as much as 6 feet in diameter, I would think. That's like a 72-foot area, circular area.
It would be, yes.
Yeah,
on
maybe
one
we should have a
scale.
max on that, I don't know.
Well, I think that's, we certainly could explore that and see if that's a tool that others are using. But I think that's also why the new number 3, to use that vernacular, I
Okay.
think that's why the new number 3 is there, is to give that person some relief from that.
Yeah, okay.
If that thing is, if the critical root zone fence is gonna preclude your ability to get to where you're trying to get to your house or do your project, then that's not gonna make a lot of
Makes
sense.
sense, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Councilor Watson?
But the problem is, then they would have to pay for an arborist, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, back to Mayor's point, do we want to put the burden on a construction company or a private homeowner to pay for an arborist when they have a tree that requires a 72-foot area? I mean, is that, I don't know. I mean, is that reasonable? I'm asking. I'm not a tree expert by any means. Is there a maximum reasonable diameter that we can set? Maybe.
I don't know that you can, but I think in one of the previous conversations that Kat Kamak had with you, he told you that our default right now is the arborist report, right? So within even the context of the code that we have today, when staff goes out to talk to somebody about a trimming permit that they have or about a construction project which potentially impacts the tree, if it can be addressed inside of the context of what we already have in the code, then we don't require an arborist report. If it can't, or if the applicant says, well, gosh, I don't really think I need to do that much, then our safety valve is in fact requiring an arborist report right now. So that's already a process that we have. It's just really actually memorializing it here in the code. So it's not a new practice for us. And I guess maybe to help the council, the vast majority of things that we do are just trimming permits. There is very little actual new construction that's taking place near the oak trees. I can't tell you that it doesn't happen, but the vast majority of citizen contacts that we have are about trimming oak trees. The other ones that we have actually are also people who want to cut them down altogether, right? And our code just straight up does not allow that unless it's disease and it's a hazard to property or to people. So probably 95% of what we do are trimming permits. They want to trim it because it's getting into their wires, or it's scraping on the edge of the roof, or it's scraping on the siding or something of the house, or it's overhanging their neighbor's fence and it's irritating their neighbor. And so that's really where most of our effort is in the trimming side, not in the construction side. But this just will provide you that additional protection when we have those kinds of permits come through.
Councilor Owen?
Another comment, Steve, on this. We have a number of places where there exists impervious surfaces already near the trees, up close to the trees. Shouldn't we have that as one of the exclusions under the, like you have 25%? If you can't solve the problem, you can have 25% encroachment. But if we're removing all the hard surface, just think about, I think on 8th Street, you have some streets there that the asphalt, the trees in the middle of the street, some of them are right at the edge of the street. We already have hard surfaces in that area. If that is going to be paved, the city's involved in paving the street. I'm looking down the road at this. Wouldn't we already have 100% compaction there? And so why would we be impacting that tree to strip that asphalt and put new layer of asphalt in there?
I'm sorry, I don't think I'm
Well,
tracking
if
with
we
the
already
question.
have impervious surfaces around the tree, shouldn't that be considered an area where you can continue to have impervious surfaces or replace that surface if the asphalt deteriorates and you have to replace it?
I would argue in the case of a public street, yes, you would absolutely do that.
And what about a driveway that's all broken up? It's a hard surface that's there.
Well, we don't actually have permit requirements for driveways in particular. So we would most likely not even engage in a conversation with
If somebody wanted to take out their driveway and
put a
replace
new
that
one in.
surface with another.
What this language is about, the 25% intrusion, is for that new project.
I understand
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
I
So,
understand.
we don't have a permit, a role in communicating with the homeowner about them replacing their driveway. So that will just happen.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's a fact,
yeah, because we don't permit driveways.
okay?
Thank you very much, Mr. Powers.
So it'll probably be a few months, but we'll be back to you with the code at your regular council meeting.
Okay. So we'll move on to item Marina. Proposed 2018 Marina rate increases. I see our harbor master, Mr. Sublett.
That's okay. Hello, Mayor, City Council members. Today, we're here to talk about proposed rate increases for the Marina for 2018. This is something that we hope to have on the April 17th agenda. Just for note, the last increase we had was April 1st, 2017 as well. So just a reminder, the Marina is an enterprise fund. We are self-supported. We rely on revenue from the businesses we have at the Marina, things such as moorage, sheds, fuel, dry storage, things like that. We don't receive any of the general funds. We are a public marina. There's a million things to do down there besides keep your boat. We host a lot of events. We've got lots of clubs. Lots of people come down there to look at birds and seals and things. And as of late, we've gotten a lot of people down there taking pictures, especially on the real nice days. The marina has some reserves built up. We have about 3 months of operating reserves. We have the bond reserve. We have an equipment rental reserve, and that's for things like the truck, bigger priced things that we use at the marina. And then our capital improvements is about $43,000. So recently we did a marina rate survey, and we looked at marinas in our area. We looked at marinas in Anacortes, Everett, LaConner, South Whidbey, and we also included Des Moines in that survey as well because they're the only other city marina like us. We took that information and then we determined the average of the prices that they charge for the same things that we do here in Oak Harbor. And we found that some of our current Oak Harbor rates are below the average and some were a little above the average. So our new proposed rates, some are a little bit lower than the average and a couple are above the average. One of the big things you have to consider when you're looking at the rates at the Oak Harbor Marina is what amenities do we have there? A lot of these amenities have downtowns where they have stores, restaurants, bars, things of that nature, or they're close to the prime cruising areas like the San Juan Islands. We don't have either of those. The Marine Advisory Committee met 6 times to talk about the marina rates. So they spent a great deal of time discussing the different methodologies and the different rates. They looked at things such as raising the marina rates according to the CPI. They looked at taking a percentage of the average, 80% of the average, and bringing our rates up to that 80% of the average compared to other marinas. And then they just looked at a few different percentages. So they talked about this for quite some time. And then what they decided to do was raise the rates by 2%, the moorage rates. And the vote was 3-1 in the end. So what they're recommending and what we're proposing is that we increase the rates at the marina by 2% for the moorage and the sheds. We're going to increase the environmental compliance fee from $5 to $7.29 per month. And that's a fee that's tied into the moorage, it's tied into the dry shed rental, and it pays for recycling and environmental things, the purchase of oil absorbent pads, any recycling we do, anything to do with the environment that costs money. That's what part of that is. We also are proposing to raise the guest electrical from $4 to $5 a night, and that's a fee a guest would pay when they come into the marina per night for electricity. The Marina Advisory Committee found that our current rate of $4 is way below what other marinas are charging. They had explained that several marinas are charging $8, $9, or even $10 a night for electricity. And then the sheds, 2% increase, are going to go from $130 a month to $134. We estimate that these new rates would increase the revenue by approximately $21,000 per year. And really, that's it. I'm happy to answer any questions. I do have the new rates here on the master fee schedule as a comparison for you to pass around.
Councilor Larson?
So Chris, I just had a quick question. I was reading in the paper today where, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that this might not cover the difference in operating costs and what you're anticipating. So is that the case? And if it is the case that this 2% increase isn't going to cover it, why wouldn't we come up with an increase that would cover that?
So the marina, the past few years has been operating in the black, which is a good thing. When I first started at the marina as harbor master, it was not. So this will cover the operating expenses. That's not exactly what I said in the interview.
Okay.
So
That's why I wanted
Yeah.
to verify.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Councilor Servatius?
Thank you. Mr. Sublette, you mentioned the Marine Advisory Committee looking at going to 80% of market. Is that what this 2% number equates to, or where does?
No. In some of the pricing categories, it will bring us to 80%, but what they were talking about was bringing all the rates below 80% of the average up to 80% of the average. In the end, they decided not to do that because they felt that some of those categories, the increase may be too much. So for example, the 60-foot pricing category, as I recall, would have gone up about 15 or 16%. So they decided in the end to do this 2% for mortgage straight across the board and then revisit it again next year.
Okay, and I would just encourage, my concern when I look at where we've gone with sewer rates. For many, many years, we kept them as low as possible and the community enjoyed that. When the time comes to provide infrastructure, then those rates, those increases seem so drastic. And I'd much rather see us try, and I'm going to trust the committee and yourself, but try and stay as competitive to those current market rates so that when we need infrastructure, we need to be able to provide those services, it doesn't seem as drastic. So I applaud you're being lean and mean, but at the same time,
Sure.
I don't want to be sticker shock. That's all. Thank you.
So could I just add something to that? Because it's a great comment, and the challenging part for us, and we see this every time the Marina Committee and the Council wrestles with the rate question. Obviously, the boats are highly mobile. And so while we look at those surrounding marinas to figure out what they're charging, as Chris pointed out, most of them, if not all of them, have amenities that we lack, whether it's proximity to downtowns or other shoreside services. And so the committee was extremely concerned about charging, in their mind, more at the Oak Harbor Marina than what our amenities that we would have. And if they charge too much, would they drive our tenants out to places like La Conner or to Anacortes? And we actually did see a bit of that occur half a dozen or so years ago when perhaps the proposed rates were too aggressive. They were adopted and there was a rationale behind it, but we did lose some of our customers. And I think the committee is particularly sensitive to that potential problem.
Thank you for that. So hopefully those rates will provide enough reserves to bring on those amenities that
I would
allow
say
things
that's a
to-
great goal, but to be honest, and we need to be, I think we lack the ability to generate enough revenue on rates alone to provide those amenities. What this will really do is allow Chris and his staff to continue the level of maintenance that they're doing, and potentially allow us to accrue enough money to have a match towards a larger grant. But we will not get to the point of developing enough reserves to do serious capital projects with our rate structure.
Councilor Allenberg?
What I hear you comparing this to is a inelastic pricing system for the marina. Yeah. that's where we're really going with that. At the other side of this thing, we have to deal with DNR. Can you, I know it's not on your agenda, can you update us regarding our negotiations with DNR relative to this rate change?
I would say that if anybody was able to answer that question in this room, it would be the mayor.
I traveled to Olympia and met with DNR to specifically discuss our lease. Lease actually ends, the current lease ends in June of 2019. They need a year in advance, so I was more than a year in advance in my negotiations. We met with State Representative Norma Smith and Representative Dave Hayes and the DNR. We negotiated a couple of different things, but the main thing was our new lease. I have an email from them that our new lease will be about $35,000 a year. DNR, that the new lease, which I'm not anxious to get started until our old lease is up a year from June. But I have a commitment from them to sign a new 10-year lease, and that annual rate will be set at about $35,000. So when you equate that to our fees in our marina, I think it's roughly, and in fact they did, we have a complicated situation because of our upland ownership. They recognized that. They came off of their normal charge for tideland leases, and I believe that equates to $3 or $4 per slip, something that we felt we could build in.
It's roughly $15,000 lower than what this 2% increase is. If your general is $21,000 revenue increase, and we're doing $35,000, so we have a built-in deficit. How do we adjust for that?
Excuse me, that's going to start next year in 2019 when our lease expires. And by then, we will keep increasing the rates, so we'll gradually work up to that.
Okay, and with that, if I can continue here. Does the DNR lease then allow us to charge for boats launching and staying overnight at the boat ramp?
That was a question that we asked them specifically, and their answer was maybe. They couldn't give us a distinct answer, believe it or not. The email they sent back to us said it was uncertain whether they could charge us.
And they also said that it's potentially that they would collect the money that we would collect from us. So in other words, we would act only as a pass-through.
Mm-hmm.
Heads they win, tails we lose.
Yes, sir.
Our other strategy, and you've heard us mention this on more than one occasion, is to actually get the new lease executed before we tackle that particular problem again, because we did not want to confuse or complicate any lease negotiations over what I think will reasonably be a very small amount of money generated. We understand that it's an important topic to some of our tenants and to some of our Marina Advisory Committee members, but it did not seem significant enough to jeopardize a 10-year lease negotiation over a few $1,000s.
Yeah. So are we able to then negotiate a lease, execute a lease, negotiate the terms of the contract, execute the contract, and have a future start date with terms that are binding on both of us? Can we do that now? For example, let's say we execute this thing June 1 to the new lease starts in June 2019. Those terms are binding on us when we sign that, but it doesn't, the execution date doesn't take place until the termination of this lease. Can we do that?
I would imagine.
Then we don't have to start charging.
It was an idea that the mayor and I talked about
Okay.
in one of our monthly meetings, because neither one of us is anxious to lose the last free year we've got. And so if that would work, great. If it doesn't work, then we'll delay that until such time as it's closer to the actual expiration of the current
Yeah.
no-fee lease.
Okay, I hear you, thanks.
Anyone else regarding Marina? Okay, thank you. And I think our final topic is finance.
Yes, exciting stuff. So I'm coming to you guys with a proposal of what I'd like to add to our budget process. And I'm using, I'm borrowing with their permission, City of Unalaska's process that I became quite familiar with when I worked up there. It's involving our capital, our improvements, and our equipment. And it's a process where they take the capital and treat it as a separate addition to the budget. And it's discussed separately. It's part of a meeting that starts with the CIP and then turns it into this document. So I just want to kind of go through this document first, and then I'll point out some of the highlights. So if you go to,
Patricia, let me ask you one question before you get started on that. In your set aside here, the required funds on this, on Alaska example, those are set aside funds that cannot be touched without the majority approval of the council, is that?
so what this does is it takes the funds that you're planning to spend for your operating budget, and it looks at them separately, but it incorporates it into the operating budget. So what you're doing is you're choosing for projects to set those up as separate items, and they actually have funds they have a general fund for capital projects, they have a electric fund for capital projects, they have different funds. It's kind of like the capital improvements that are ongoing, and once the capital improvements are done, then those are switched over to the capital part of it's a way to segregate it, and then they take it another step where you do projects within those funds. So every project that's approved becomes a project in their accounting system. No, it's okay. But, so what this is, so if you go to the second page, this is the official acceptance that's required as part of the process. And if you go to that's page 137, it starts, the document starts with an overview of timing of projects. So it color codes, general fund is orange, electric's yellow, water's green, purple for solid waste. Anyway, so it gives you a visual picture. It tells you what the appropriated funds, what have been requested and appropriated through the process, and then it gives you a timeline on when those projects will occur. So some of them cross years, some of them are short-term within the year, but it gives you kind of a visual picture of the timeline of those projects. Then when you go to the next page, it gets into the details year by year. So Unalaska approves their budget. They only do a one-year budget. They don't do a biannual. So this page is the page that's actually adopted into the budget. And it takes, so general fund, it lists what projects they're going to do for 2018 or transfer funding into for future years. And it shows you what they've already appropriated. So they have appropriated funding of $78,500 for general fund. They have request of $1,748,000 for a total of what they want to see happen in those projects that are listed. It lists out the different funding streams. So general fund, it shows what the total is, and then it gives you grant in general fund, the other total, and then it gives you a total. And as you go down through the proprietary, some of the proprietary funds have general fund that is requested to be part of the proprietary funds. Some of the proprietary funds have debt service, or so those are shown. And it also totals the columns by, when you look at 18, you can go to the city grand total, and you can look under, say, the general fund for financing. It shows the total request to general fund for 2018 is $2,747,093. The total request to the budget would be $50,757,300. So it gives you a summary. Then it goes year by year. So if you go into 19, it shows the same thing. Go to 20, 21, 22, so it does a 5-year look. And then it has a final page that looks pretty similar to what we do in our CIP plan, where you take all the revenue of the projects that you're gonna do, and they just group it in general fund or proprietary, and then it lists the funding sources. And that's on page 143 of this. Then the part that I really like, that I think is really, would be really helpful, I like, of course, the spreadsheets, you know, I'm an accountant, but the part that I think would be helpful to council and to community is there's a description of each one of the projects that you want to do, and pictures that are associated with it, funding at the bottom. And there's a couple here that don't have a budget listed, they just because they're buying a piece of equipment, a software program, there's really nothing other than buying the software program. But if you go to page 147, it's the haystack security fence. They then break this out by the different costs associated, design, cost and admin, and that total that you budget matches where they've located the funding. So it gives you both, and they're saying they're going to be doing this whole project with grant funding. The next page shows the funding is from general fund. This is more of a they're putting it around the shoreline for, what's it called? S-curve pathways. They're creating a path, it looks like. But anyway, so the point I guess I'm making is, in the final budget document, the reason they're not starting at page 135 is this is an addition to the budget document. So at any point, community members or council can go see what is the 5-year plan, what is the cost, how are we going to fund it, and in detail, and or looking at the different things. The final page, because I won't make you look at all the detail.
Can I ask one more question?
Go ahead.
So you tie this also into our comp plan then too?
Yes, it
Yeah.
starts with the CIP plan,
Yeah.
and then it pulls it in, but some things on CIP are, they're large, but you have some costs that you want to do
This
that are,
is more refined.
yeah, it's more
closer
about
to-
the budget.
Okay.
Yeah, what we actually are gonna plan to spend. The comp plan and the CIP from that are, the big picture, looking at what we want to do as a city, and Steve could probably explain more that it does. I'm just giving. Okay. If you go to page 172, then it gets into the part that I also like. It's called the rolling stock replacement plan. This one is a 1 year, as I said, so it lists for 2018 for them what they anticipate replacing. So they list all the things they currently have, what the year of the equipment is, what they think their life cycle was, what the replacement date was supposed to be, and what they ended up asking for. So they're asking to replace $1,176,000 in equipment. They also listed out by which fund is asking for the equipment. We have a different system because we already have set aside our 502 funds for the majority of our equipment, so it's already sitting in an account where we've transferred funds to sit there. So ours will look a little different than this, but I thought this was kind of a good place to make sure that we discuss that at the time of budget versus each department talking about the equipment they want to buy. It'd be great to be able to just do this as one big picture for the city.
Don't we already have out Sandra doing a replacement type funding for us?
For the equipment,
Maybe,
right?
is that for all? Can you kind of give Kathy just a recap of what she's doing? Is it kind of similar to this?
It's very similar. I think what Patricia is suggesting is that it be included in the capital purchases part of the budget.
Just come all together.
And Sandra has looked at this and she thinks it would be very helpful.
Oh, good. Okay, thank you.
And
Great.
the whole goal is that this would hopefully be a process that once approved, then Sandra wouldn't have to come to you guys every time she wants to replace something for the year. If it's been approved here and it's within what you've approved, then council is given their consent. That's the goal. So it streamlines the process. It allows potential merging of purchasing 3 pieces of equipment at once to get a savings, or planning around what's the word I'm looking for? There's a cycle that happens for replacements. There's Sandra, come on.
Oh, the state contract?
There you go. Around the state contract, because you don't want to miss that, because you may have greater savings if you follow that. So that's kind of the goal. of this. And then the final goal, again, is looking at it for 5 years. Not just looking at what we're gonna replace for our 2-year budget cycle, look at what our plan is for our equipment so that that you guys know what's going on. The age of the equipment, the health of the equipment. This would be probably customized a little bit more, but that would be the goal.
Thank you, Mayor. So perhaps occasionally we've had a disaster, someone crunches a car and it's not till the end of the 5 years. This could be adapted to put it,
I would think if it was outside of what we anticipated, then it would still need to come before council. But if it was something that was in here that we said we were going to do, then I would think that, I would hope, you can just say yes or no, that this would be the approval document. The document that would be transparent and allow council to have a say, have a voice, but it would come at one time instead of in little pieces.
okay, or if it's at the end of the 5 year and we now need to do it at 2.5, then it would move up and something else would just shift back. But
Yeah.
do the department heads seem to, have they looked at this very much? I mean,
Purchasing is where I mainly, Public Works and Purchasing,
Okay.
and I ran it by them to get their
Okay.
opinion. Part of what I was told, and I've noticed since I've been here, transparency of what we're doing in capital projects is, we know it internally, but it isn't real easy for people externally to know. Same thing with equipment. We bring a piece of equipment to you one piece at a time. Do you really remember what you saw back at budget? This would make this part of the formal budget document. It would be easy to see. It would be easy to identify what our equipment was. My goal is efficiencies. And I think that for efficiencies and transparency, that's what I'm suggesting. But it's just a suggestion, and we're getting ready to start the budget process, so that's one of the reasons. I wanted to just talk through a little bit more on how this works. So when you talk about 2018 projects, they would be put in separate funds. I'd like to set up separate CIP funds, one called General Fund Projects, another one called Marina Fund Projects, Senior Center Projects, Water Projects, and have those all there. Redmond, the city of Redmond actually does that too. I've seen theirs. It's a very easy way to tell what you've put in, what you've spent, what you have left to spend. You can identify the number of projects. It kind of gives you a better reporting, either detail or summary related. It would also allow the capital portion to be approved as part of the operating budget, so it could be concentrated on specifically. We could spend a workshop just talking about that, or multiple workshops if there's any contention. That way you guys have a voice before we actually finalize anything. It would be done in conjunction with estimated revenues and operating expenses, because we can't do it separate, but it would be something that would be discussed in detail by itself. The other reasons I think it would help is it gives you a more in-depth look. It provides a summary, provides description and pictures so you can visually see it. It setting up separate funds would allow for projects to be created and tracked. If, say, we set up a budget for something that we set up the budget for $1 million and it was that's what we put in there, and something happened, we came back with an amendment to increase that budget to $1.1 million. It would also require a budget amendment that you would have to approve to adjust that project budget so that the financial side would be approved at the same time the work would be approved. So it would give you a double check, and it would also give us a way to make sure we were following what you guys were looking for. And that's it. And then if you guys would like that, then this would be incorporated into the budget calendar and the process that we do.
it seems very straightforward. It's black and white. It can be adjusted if we need to.
Absolutely.
But as you say, we're not piecemealing it every other year. And, we can always tweak it as we go along
Absolutely.
if something doesn't, but at least
Customize it to our own circumstances.
it seems to be, more planned communication for certain things.
So the way I'm looking at this, or I'm understanding it, this isn't in lieu of or replacing anything in the current budget line. This is going to be in addition to for greater clarification and transparency.
Yes.
I don't see a downside to it except how much more time and effort is going to be needed to generate this, and who's going to be responsible for that.
Well, finance gets to be responsible because we love to do this stuff, but where's Tally? Oh, she left. But this is important to me because a lot of questions come up about capital equipment. A lot of questions come up about vehicles. I hear that. People don't know where to go look. They don't know where it's at. This would give you it right away. You would have it, and then we'd have a process to report on those projects. They would be set up, and there'd be a way to report on those at any point that council would like us to.
Thank you.
I recently went through an educational time with Kathy Rosen and Sandra Place when a replacement hit my desk, and they spent about an hour or more educating me, and I am convinced that we have a pretty darn good process. I think this will make it better. We don't replace our vehicles just because they're 3 or 4 years old. We have a good look at whatever that asset is and the mileage. Can we use it longer? We go through that question. So which is, I'm impressed about that, and you know, I was trying to be the hard nose, we're just replacing something here, but I think we do a pretty darn good job. So my hat's off to those folks and how they handle that. If we are doing something that's not already approved, it definitely comes to council. I mean, if we're going to add a vehicle, just like if we're going to add an employee, those kinds of things, they come to council. They have to get approval. So if we're just replacing an asset, we have a pretty good process, I think. Yes, Councilor Holmes.
Thank you, Mayor. There's two things that would happen if there was a disaster, as Mayor Pro Tem Munn said. That's an insurance thing. Theoretically, for value, it's budget neutral unless there's really no value left to that vehicle that got crunched. The other part is it's going to require you to forecast revenues out in advance of 2 years.
Right.
And we've had pretty conservative forecasts in the past. If we follow that policy, this should be reliable if we have conservative revenue
Yes.
forecasts.
And what I want to say on that too is we're only going to approve. This will give a 5-year look, but we'll only be approving the 2 years of budget. So the forecast will still be done conservatively, which is in the best interest, but the 2 years that we do in the biennial budget is all that council would officially approving to be spent. The rest of it would be just looking out as to what we anticipate happening. It wouldn't be we used to call it in Alaska, we refined the system, that's why I'm so familiar with it. When you went out to the 5th year, there was some really amazing stuff that we wanted to do, but we really had no idea how we were going to do it. So it would be other. We had an other column, and they kind of decided maybe that was kind of getting people's hopes up. So that's part of what we worked on, and I feel strongly about. I don't want to predict something that we really don't know how we're going to pay for.
Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, Councilor.
Thank you, Garry. I applaud the effort, the vision. One of the buzzwords that I know Mr. Holmberg and I encounter with the wastewater treatment plant is a funding matrix, and I think you're building a funding matrix
That's my goal.
for the city here. So this is a pretty enormous document. If your team is up for that challenge, I don't remember where I heard this thing. It was a podcast or something I was listening to. They're talking about typos, and in the written word you'll notice a typo pretty quick, but with numbers, if you're up for this challenge, you think about transposing a couple of digits, that it's going to move its way, I'm assuming, through the entire document.
It potentially could, but the goal is we'll be getting the detail from Public Works or whatever department's doing the projects, and we'll be editing that, and we'll be sending it back to the different departments to actually make sure any things look like they're supposed to.
All right, and that's kind of, I think, what Councilmember Larson touched on. And Mayor, I too applaud the fact that we're looking out. I know we're approving 2 years at a time. We've talked about this at the council, and I hope we have a retreat coming up to start to look at goals that are further out than just 2 years, that are 5 years, and then we can start to put a budget behind those council goals. So thank you for taking that on. Thank you.
I like it too.
Anyone else? Any further business the council would like to discuss, talk about? Okay, seeing none, then we'll adjourn. Oh,
I would like to touch on something.
yes.
Just attended the Open Public Meetings Act training in Coopville, and Ken Doherty from MRSC was there doing that work. And one of the things that he reiterated was there's only 2 types of meeting, regular or special. We'll call them workshops, we'll call them retreats. And he emphasized the point that you can take action at a special meeting, even if it's not on the agenda. And so I would like, as a group, that we could set the precedent, if something would have come up in this meeting, that we as a council can make a motion and take action. I know traditionally we hadn't, but I'd like to figure out what we need to do, or if it's just a conscious decision, because we clearly can take action on items. You move to instruct staff to blah, blah, blah. And we traditionally haven't done that, but I think it would be more efficient if something comes up that if we want to move on that we can. So I don't know if my peers have any thoughts. It's something that's, I don't know, bothered is the right word, but something that I've mulled over, because I think it's just a lack of efficiency that if something comes up, we absolutely have the ability to take action, even though we traditionally, I don't know how this one was advertised, but it says no action will be taken. So any thoughts, Mayor? You don't have to answer now, but I'd like to maybe look at getting that.
Yeah, I'd have to look into it
Okay.
more, yeah, than to try to answer that right now. Yes.
I bet
Mayor Pro Tem.
MRSC could help us come up with the proper notice wording if we want to take action. You know, right now it always says no action, but
Right.
since it seems to be a change, we could work with them on the wording so that our staff isn't fumbling to try to figure out what wording they need to have. But if that was in on the training, my next meeting with them won't be until June, so.
Well, he was very specific, and I asked again at the end, and it's something I think, I don't want to task you with that, but guess what? I guess you. He just made it very clear that it's special or it's regular. And even these workshops, that was an interesting point, where they're always, the public knows they're the third or fourth Wednesday. This essentially becomes a regularly scheduled meeting. It's not something that just crops up. And so he was very clear that you can absolutely take action if something comes up and needs a motion.
What was his name again?
Kent Doherty, I believe,
He's
but he's one of the
lawyers.
attorneys at MRSC. And he said there's lots of articles on it that they've written.
Good.
Thank you.
We'll reach out. Thank you. Yes.
I'd just like to say, if there is no legal hurdle and we can get beyond that, I would certainly support being able to, and moving forward with taking action at these meetings. I feel like we're doing 2.5 meetings a month now because we're hamstrung. So if there's a way to accomplish that, then I fully support being able to take action at these workshops.
Okay. Look into it. Great. Okay, no further business. We're adjourned.
Real quick, things with badges. Correctional Officer Danielle Arnett's having her little at the jail from 4 to 5. I'm going to go over there and visit. She wanted me to extend that offer if anybody wanted to meet her little.